I would say to think back to the question about Richmond and civil rights, um, direct action protest and civil disobedience cast a very long shadow over how we remember the movement. Uh, in fact, it drew so much media attention that people often forget that there were other ways that people organized strategies to meet the challenges of Jim Crow segregation. It still shocks me to this day that many people don't know that Richmond's greatest contribution to the American civil rights movement had very little to do with direct action protests and more to do with voting rights. People were registered to vote here almost a decade before the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They built one of the most successful voting rights constituencies in the South. In many ways, if the movement was about protest to politics, I think Richmonders and Virginians, even more importantly, beat the rest of their Southern counterparts to the punch. And they were deeply organized. And that deep organization, by the way, is something that seems lost on contemporary actors. Like I said before, I think the idea that civil disobedience and direct action protests was a last resort, by the way, and it could have never happened if people hadn't been thoroughly organized for decades before the civil rights movement. And I think one of the things to our detriment that we forget about the civil rights movement is just how thoroughly people were organized. And what I'm going to talk about today, I can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A. I'm going to talk about what they were fighting against. And it's some deeply pernicious belief systems that resonate very profoundly in the present. So I'll talk a little bit about memory and history. I'm going to speak very broadly, and I'll burrow into a couple examples that perhaps get us to think more intently about what history is and what it isn't. And there's probably no better way to look at what history is and is not than to think about the mythologies of the lost cause. So this is it, right? This is one of my favorite pictures of history. It's history up in the top right-hand corner is as the proverbial naked truth, and historians clamoring over writing it like children. And if you know anything about historians, that's exactly how we behave. And either way, it encapsulates what I'm going to talk. This painting does in some ways about history being an interpretive endeavor. This is what the cartoon is getting at over here by David Horsey from the Seattle Times. Those who, we hear these cliches all the time about what history is. And, I ask my students, I'm like, why do we study history? Oh, so we don't, repeat the mistakes of the past. And like, nonsense. We do it all the time, by the way. We continue in many ways to be duty bound in some ways to do the things that historical actors have done. Or, I think it was Mark Twain that said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. We can't agree on anything. So what we have here is history is the naked truth upright, supervising the actual writing of history. Well, what is it, right? I think it's one of the things that we're finding students, if you ask a kid, or my colleague at there says this quite regularly. If you ask a kid, a student, their freshman year in college, what a Bunsen burner is, they all know what it is. Everyone will raise their hand. If you ask them what a monograph is, right, no one knows what that is, right? This idea that books are essential to what history is, or even what history is, seems to be this kind of opaque endeavor. We think we know what it is. We do it quite regularly, and we teach it even more regularly, but it's not something that's generally discussed. It's something that people think they know, but in many instances they don't. And I think there's a big difference between heritage and history, right? Heritage is what we're talking about today. It's like, it is based on features of the past that people decide to keep, often in spite of evidence and information. It is not what happened in the past only, but what some have decided is worthy of preservation. History attempts to reconstruct and understand the events and experience of historical actors. History follows rules of evidence and interpretation. That is what we call the historical method. The practice of history requires constant debate and revision, especially as new evidence comes to light and discoveries, not only historical discoveries, give rise to new interpretations. Memory and history, there's a really good quote by Michael Conway in The Atlantic that really begins to encapsulate the difference not only between heritage and history, but memory. In history, is anything but agreeable, right? It is a collection of facts deemed to be official, but it is not, rather, a collection of facts deemed to be official by scholars on high. There's a collection, oh, this thing is in my way, give me 1 second, of historians exchanging different and often conflicting analyses. History may be an attempt to memorialize and preserve the past, but it is not memory. Memories can serve as primary sources, but they do not stand alone as history. What we're finding, for instance, in college is students can work with primary sources, but they don't know the narrative. They don't know the story. I've seen students in archives discover primary sources and have no idea that the primary source they discovered is actually like a profound source because they don't understand the context behind that source. A history is essentially a collection of memories analyzed and reduced into meaningful conclusions, right? So I'm going to talk a bit about, Confederate iconography and statuary, but I'm going to start in another place, right? I think it was Malcolm Gladwell who said that statues are reflections of things that people take seriously. In some ways, they encapsulate this kind of age-old debate between real versus imagined history. The city of Philadelphia erects this statue in 1982, and it's a statue of Rocky Balboa, right? Rocky has become synonymous with American upward mobility and Italian culture in the city of Philadelphia. However, an actual real boxer came from Philadelphia named Joe Frazier, who actually beat Muhammad Ali in 1971. The city of Philadelphia did not erect a statue, right, to Joe Frazier until 2015. In fact, they erected a statue to an imaginary boxer before they erected one to an actual real boxer who was by all intents and purposes a legend. And what does the memorialization of Rocky Balboa, decades before the memorialization and statuary dedicated to Joe Frazier, tell us about what Philadelphians value? We can gain a lot from thinking about monuments, what people intended when they built them, and what those monuments come to symbolize, but even more importantly, what they tell us about the different. If you didn't know anything about Philadelphia history, you might walk away thinking Rocky Balboa was an actual boxer, right? At least in between 1982 and 2015, before they erected a statue to Joe Frazier, right? So we have to think very intently about the distinctions between heritage and history and memory, and how these things can often distort, perhaps even cloud, how we think about what historians do and how teachers teach it. Charlottesville was about memory, not just monuments. It's the age-old battle, as I said, between heritage and history. You know, you have to, my friends I went to UVA for graduate school and in the history department, and there's a book that just came out called Charlottesville 2017, where the authors ask themselves a very profound question about whether the Unite the Right rally of August 2017, where Heather Heyer lost her life, was an invasion or a homecoming. Whether or not UVA's history of racism and the promotion of race sciences like eugenics are more in keeping with its identity, or this kind of progressive mythology that we often think Charlottesville is, right? And one of the things we know is that Confederate sympathizers, and this was embodied not only in the contention that transpired on Monument Avenue, but also up in Charlottesville, is that Confederate sympathizers see monuments as essential to heritage. Others, especially African Americans and their allies, see them as reflections of a mythologized, exclusionary past that fails to take the entirety of history into account. And when I say the entirety of history, I am really talking about slaves. Another thing that we know is that most Confederate statues were built in the 20th century. The only statue on Monument Avenue before they were taken down, that was built in the 19th century, was the statue to Robert E. Lee in 1890. And that's some years after the end of the Civil War. Many of them were erected at what we call the nadir of American race relations in the early 20th century. And then again, at the century mark of the Civil War, and of course, very conspicuously in 1960 or between 1940 and the 1960s during the culmination of what becomes the American Civil Rights Movement. But we see this idea memorialize the Confederacy in a manner that corresponds directly with particular things that are going on in American history. And I want you to think intently about What was happening in between 1900 and 1920 that might have left, given rise to this anxious pursuit to remember Confederate leaders and Confederate soldiers? What was happening in the 1960s that might have given rise to this explosion in Confederate naming, monuments, to courthouses and other sites? I'm not a Southerner, you can tell by my accent, but all African Americans are from the South, one generation or two removed. But my mom had never been to Richmond before. And I remember the first time I drove her down Monument Avenue, she was like, boy, you couldn't tell the South lost the war by driving down this street. And I said, that's exactly what they intended you to think. And I want us to, and how then does that statuary and has the history masqueraded, or I'm sorry, has the heritage masqueraded as history for so long? So I'll talk a little bit about the institutionalization of beliefs that people now think are secondhand. But I'm going to back up before I get going and think intently about how foreigners thought about the United States, and what they thought about the United States cast a very long shadow over who we became. In 1835, a French aristocrat named Alexis de Tocqueville actually came to the United States and observed our culture. We were still a young country then, as many of you know, and he wrote a book called Democracy in America. And it's one of the best, to this day, one of the best observations. There's glaring omissions, but there's deeply poignant insight in this book about who America was in the early 19th century. Tocqueville had some pretty interesting things to say about slavery and about race. And what he said, I refer to as Tocqueville's quandary, and it really lights the way going forward, right? Tocqueville defined the alternatives available to slaveholding states with simplicity. He said they might emancipate the Negroes and treat them with some degree of civility, or perpetuate their serfdom for as long as possible. Emancipation, he saw, would solve few problems in the immediate future. The evidence suggested that freedom for the part of African Americans intensified rather than alleviated the prejudices on behalf of whites. What Tocqueville is saying is he gave Americans a choice. You can either perpetuate slavery for as long as you can, or you can manumit slaves and treat them with some degree of dignity. What Tocqueville knew in 1835 is that while African Americans were not fully recognized civic actors, they had cast a very long shadow over American politics, and it was going to become a problem if the United States didn't fix it. He wrote this book 30 years before the Civil War, right? We know what choice America made, by the way, right? The story of the Jim Crow South is the story of the perpetuation of African American serfdom. I mean, we think of segregation in many ways in the most either benign or deeply pessimistic ways. It's either segregated lunch counters or it's lynching. There are all these things in between, like redlining and stripping people of voting rights, that have a profound influence on the development of the region well into the course of the 20th century. Tocqueville would have called that perpetuation of serfdom. We would call it the perpetuation of African-American second-class citizenship. It is impossible, by the way, to separate the rise of Confederate iconography from the perpetuation of African-American serfdom. Part of the reason we're having this discussion about Confederate iconography right now is because of this tortured racial history that we can't seem to reconcile over. I am convinced that had the United States actually done something meaningful to address its racial problems, many of these things will be a punchline, but we didn't, right? But there's another portion of this, and this is why I just want to bring this up for Joe Louis, just because I love boxing, and I think it's imperative that we think of the Lewis story as an immigrant story. In fact, for those African Americans who left the South during the Great Migrations, you have to think of them as immigrants. They would have seen the South in some ways as a foreign country, at least home, but foreign nonetheless, right? And the story of African Americans beyond the South is in ways an immigrant story. It's the story, but this story of migrants belies the politics of upward mobility that undergirds the American dream. This is why we struggle to deal with African American history generally, because it forces us to question how much progress we have and have not made, right? The story of African Americans gets back to the perpetuation of serfdom that Tocqueville talked about in 1835. You can't call yourself a democracy, right? And a sizable portion of your population doesn't have access to the kind of vestiges of the democratic state. Lewis may have triumphed in the ring, we know, but the story of African-American migrants beyond the South tells another story. We know why Philadelphia didn't erect the statue to Joe Frazier, right? They didn't erect the statue to Joe Frazier because Philadelphia has a longstanding problem with racism, and they didn't want to venerate an African-American. So they venerated an imaginary boxer instead. And in some ways, we are still grappling in the South with an imaginary history, a history written by real people with real ideas, but a mythology nonetheless, right? So what is the mythology, right? It's a picture of the Jeff Davis Memorial unveiled in 1907. It's grounded in what we call the lost cause. And the lost cause is an interpretation of the Civil War that seeks to present the war from the perspective of Confederates in the best possible terms. It's that simple. Developed by white Southerners almost immediately after the war. Lee was central to it, by the way, because he was defiant about African Americans' humanity and their intelligence. Many of their former Confederate generals in a post-war climate of economic, racial, and social uncertainty, right? And to put it another way, the South didn't know how the North was going to treat them after the end of the Civil War, because a lot of people died. More people died in the Civil War than Americans died in the Second World War. And they have to come up with ideas to rationalize what they've done in the court of public opinion. So the lost cause creates and romanticizes an old South. And the Confederate war effort, often distorting history in the process, becomes a variation of heritage rather than history. There are several components of the lost cause that are worthy of note because they still saturate American memory to this day. The first is that secession, not slavery, caused the war, by the way. The second is that Blacks were faithful and happy slaves. Right? Even more importantly, that slave owners were benevolent paternalists, and that slavery was a benign, just the Gone with the Wind version of the American South. And because slavery was a benevolent and benign institution, and slave owners were benevolent paternalists, and Blacks were happy and unprepared for freedom, by the way, whoever died on behalf of the Confederate cause was heroic. Robert E. Lee, of course, was the most heroic soldier. And this is how people came to think about reimagining the emergence of Confederate statuary. But even more importantly, this is where it really becomes a lost cause. The South was destined to lose because the North had advantages and resources and men. There are, the United States, we generally tend to think that racism becomes more caustic the further you go down the economic ladder. That it's something the lower classes participate in and not people up, not social elites. In fact, we know that social elites were actually almost single-handedly responsible for the lost cause. And Mildred Lewis Rutherford is one of these examples, right? The lost cause emerges not only as a way to rationalize the past, but to make sense of the rise of Jim Crow segregation and control the present. And during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, private organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy spearheaded movements to legitimize the Confederacy's role in perpetuating the Civil War. As early as 1919, as Civil War veterans began to die. By the way, that's exactly why you see many of those statues being built in the 1920s. It also corresponds with the rise of white nationalism in the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, but that's another matter. The United Daughters of the Confederacy resolved to embed their beliefs into American history and textbooks. Mildred Lewis Rutherford, a prominent educator, Ku Klux Klan sympathizer, and member of the UDC, Sons of the Confederate Veterans, and the UCV, established the Rutherford Committee in Atlanta, Georgia. The Rutherford and the committee eventually published the now infamous pamphlet of lost cause beliefs called A Measuring Rod to Test Textbooks and Reference Books in Schools, Colleges, and Libraries. Measuring Rod set the standard, and I'm going to tell you how long this standard lasted for in a second. It contained key assertions of the lost cause, urged Southerners to ignore historical sources, literally, and romanticize the Confederate war effort. And I think if we actually look at the historical documents instead of mythologizing about the past, the progeny of Confederate soldiers and leadership were actually pretty explicit about what they were embarking on in the early 20th century. And Measuring Rod argues that it was Southerners' due purpose to reject a book that calls the Confederate soldier a traitor or rebel, reject the book that says the South fought to hold their slaves, reject the book that speaks of slave owners, or slaveholders rather, as of the South as cruel and unjust to its slaves, reject the textbook that admits to tell the South's heroes and their deeds, right? Lost cause supporters spent the years after 1919 urging libraries, colleges, and school boards to ban them that emphasize the Union war effort, the role of slavery in causing the war, and the inhumanities of the slave system. And they were deeply successful. They were deeply successful for all the reasons that Brent Carter talked about earlier. Because African Americans couldn't vote, right? Jim Crow legislatures throughout the South mandate lost cause talking points just like this in history textbooks, in large part because these oligarchies of these collections of well-landed individuals who have almost, think of it, I'm sure this came up earlier, Virginia had one of the lowest voter turnout rates in the world in the early portion of the 20th century, and the lowest voter turnout rate in the United States in the early 20th century, which meant it makes it a lot easier to expedite ideas like this through the political process and get them mandated in textbooks. History is a high stakes game, man. It always has been. A lot is on the line when we begin to think about how we imagine the past and what gets put and left out, what gets enlightened and what gets put into history textbooks. I mean, look at this stuff, man. Right? This is actually the Richmond Times-Dispatch actually just did an expose on the Cavalier Commonwealth, which was a Jim Crow mandated textbook. These textbooks were not phased out of the Virginia curriculum into the 1970s and the 1980s. And the textbooks that replaced them were not much better, by the way. So we're still working with this, right? I mean, look at, that's a picture on the top left-hand corner of the middle passage, by the way. So I guess they were, you know, Africans dressed in Victorian garb, shaking hands with their future owners. Early Virginians, the history of the General Assembly made laws closely controlling the Negroes. However, the laws not fully enforced. Many slave masters did not like to have state government meddle in what they considered their private business. They managed their servants according to their own methods. They knew best. The best way to control their slaves was to win their confidence and affection. Many Negroes were taught to read and write. Many of them were allowed to meet in groups for preaching, for funerals, and for singing and dancing. They went visiting at night and sometimes owned guns and other. I mean, this is absolute nonsense, by the way. And there were generations of people who were actually raised on this stuff. The same 7th grade textbook depicted a painting of George Washington overseeing his slaves at Mount Vernon. The caption read that Virginia offered a better life for Negroes than did Africa, by the way. So what a benign institution. So the Richmond Times-Dispatch, like I said, just recently analyzed these textbooks. Here's what the Cavalier Commonwealth held: that the slave did not work so hard as the average free laborer, since he did not have to worry about losing his job. In fact, the slave enjoyed what we might call comprehensive social security. Generally speaking, his food was plentiful, his clothing adequate, his cabin warm, his health protected, and his leisure carefree. Slave owners and slaves understood that bondage, as they knew it, was not totally evil. Both realized that enslavement in the civilized world had been better in many respects for the Negro than the barbarities he might have suffered in Africa. This is like white supremacy 101. And Lee came as close as any man to fulfilling the best ideals of what the genuine should be. Here's what we know after looking at the documents. Slaves were often sickly, meaning they had dysentery, typhoid, hepatitis, high infant mortality rates, worms, tetanus, rickets, you name it. And they constantly challenged the boundaries of the master-servant relationship, right? Historians generally agree that slavery, more than any other issue, brought on the war. Even a cursory search of the University of Richmond's digitization of the Virginia Secession Convention demonstrates just this. The word slavery during the Virginia Secession hearings comes up over 500 times, while states' rights is mentioned only a mere 29 times. Now, states' rights is mentioned more in relationship to slavery than 29 times, but slavery far and away eclipses any reference to states' rights. Historical documents demonstrate that Lee's benevolence as a slave master on the plantation that is now Arlington Cemetery, or contains portion of it, is deeply contestable. Before its constitution in 1890, Virginia's governor Fitz Lee, who was also a Civil War veteran, not only refused to build Richmond's Lee statue on the Capitol grounds where it was supposed to go in the first place, he opened a plain business proposal. In fact, here's an ad for Clark Gable up in the top right-hand side there. Smoke up, Richmonders, all together and pull together. Lose your hammer, forget you ever had one, and stop knocking, but boost. Monument Avenue park lots. You got to think of it this way. At the turn of the last century, Monument Avenue, what is Monument Avenue? Now it's still a suburb, by the way. It was on the periphery, on the edge of Richmond. And it said Monument Avenue park lots are supplying a long felt want of those people at Richmond desiring to live on beautiful Monument Avenue. Look at the restrictions down here, by the way. No lot can ever be sold or rented in Monument Avenue Park to any person of African descent no liquor will be allowed, yada, yada, yada. This place, that avenue was built in some ways to attract not only the progeny of slaveholders, but a nouveau riche group of Southerners to build a community around the idea of the lost cause. And in building that community around the idea of the lost cause, Richmond's areas were allowed in some ways to, we romanticize in African-American communities a lot about segregation, saying, oh, we had our own stuff. What we forget is, yeah, what we might have, but our neighborhoods were still, like slaves, often still sick. They didn't put sewage systems in Churchill in the 1950s. People were, hot water, don't even think about it, right? There were upwards of 8 dumps in Jackson Ward. People were dying from diseases in the 1950s in the Jackson Ward and Churchill and Fulton area and Navy Hill from diseases that had been eradicated from white communities. And so you cannot divorce Monument Avenue from the kind of polarity of experience that characterized Richmond in the mid-20th century. And this is why I think people, are going, a lot of people say, well, what does George Floyd or police violence have to do with Confederate monuments? And I think if you take in light what I just said, and the kind of the perpetuation of these mythologies, people see the perpetuation of serfdom that Tocqueville talked about in 1825, or 1835 rather, is inextricably linked to Confederate statuary and Confederate memory. My colleagues up at UVA argue that seen through the lens of history, not heritage, by the way, these statues are more easily recognized as silent heralds of a deeply entrenched systems of political disenfranchisement, educational injustice, health inequities, and neighborhood marginalization. And the heritage has got to be questioned. Confederate monuments represent the types of symbols that emerge in the absence of democracy. There was never a popular mandate in the city of Richmond or throughout much of the South. And mind you, Virginia has more monuments to the Confederacy than any state in the former Confederacy. On whether or not to build these, they were done on public property, often with private monies, despite the fact that many Richmonders of the African-American persuasion had their own opinions about putting those monuments up. And they emerged when people attempt to rationalize culture built from human bondage, a civil war when hundreds of thousands of Americans perished, and a political system that stole democracy, robbing Black Americans and poor whites of their constitutional liberties. The dirty little secret about the Constitutional Convention of 1901 and 1902 in Virginia is it also disenfranchised 50% of white voters in the Commonwealth. So this is really politics is really a rich person's endeavor for most of the 20th century here. The most common first name, oh, by the way, this is a joke, by the way. I had to put this in here for history teachers, by the way, because this is another thing my colleague says. The most common first name of history teachers across America for far too long has been Coach, right? My history teachers in high school were coaches. And in scrutinizing how the Lee Monument came to be, Zayana Bryant up in Charlottesville was actually questioning how and why history is told. A 15-year-old delved into affairs of not just history, but also historiography, the cumulative effort of historians to interpret the past. And in doing so, she ignited the battle for Charlottesville's soul and demonstrated that Americans' inability to grapple with its tortured racial history has educational implications, which is why I'm talking about this right now. Brian's quest spotlighted a serious flaw in our history education. Most students in the United States learn history as an established linear narrative, a set of facts that point toward progress. The advanced placement system has rushed generations of students through vital portions of American history. Recent American history is almost always untold. Generally, the teaching of history often urges rote memorization over investigating the processes of writing historical narratives and recognizing how inherent biases shape conventional instructional materials. The result, an era often masquerades as history, many young Americans of the past and the forces that influence its production, right? And we're paying for the sin of omission, I think, that the Confederacy, historical memory of the Confederacy stood for. I have written elsewhere that this sin of omission in the mythologies that for far too long have characterized American history, suffice it to say, the teaching of the American past is as much about productive citizenry and heritage as history. Until recently, textbook portrayed America as a triumph narrative. Story often emphasized European progress, colonist mastery over nature and natives, and the divine providence of constitutional republicanism. Until African Americans and racial minorities began to write their own histories, Stories of the United States were written by and for white Americans. There is nothing controversial about that statement, by the way. Crack open any textbook from the mid-20th century as an exercise. They're primary documents now, by the way. And minorities are not nearly absent. When they surface in these texts, they're almost always portrayed as inconsequential and dehumanized figures. African American, even other racial minorities for that matter, are actors without agency or event, which gets us back to thinking more broadly about how we can atone, right, for these sins of omission and these glaring deficiencies in how we think about what history is and it is not. And you know, every historian's favorite old historian is, you know, Frederick Jackson Turner, and he wrote that each age tries to write history of the past to do with references to conditions uppermost in its own time. In fact, those who insist that history is simply the effort to tell the thing exactly as it was, to state the facts, are confronted with the difficulty that the fact which they would represent is not planted on solid ground of fixed conditions. Right, which gets me to the last point before we discuss, is that prompts from the past can inform inquiries into the past. The continuity of American racism, this is why we're here, by the way, at this moment. In large part, like, people wouldn't take issue, for instance, let's say with symbols like pyramids, which may or may have been built by slavery in large part, but because the legacy of that slavery, and we're not sure it was even slavery at all, has been long washed away. The reason why we keep relitigating this history is because it continues to inform the present, right? That racism is being more thoroughly filmed has shocked America into realizing just how far we have and have not come. These events and images have forced experts back to the drawing table to think intently about our past, what histories we value, and how both continue to shape the present. And I'll say so, people have lived and died on this planet believing in things that we now know are patently false. We will live and die believing in things that future actors know are patently false. And those beliefs are going to dictate how we think about the past. So it's always evolving. The past is always acting on us. And I think there's a tendency in popular dialogue to think just because histories were written first, that they were written correctly. We have to go back and think about the biases that historical actors brought to bear on the histories they chose to write and the people that they decided to emphasize. That is why I think people in the 21st century are reinterrogating Confederate statuary and memorialization. All history is revisionist. People are telling a story about something that has already happened. You know, the word revisionism is loaded right now with a lot of political implications. But I wanted us just to talk about how people have used sources. Ultimately, what I'm discussing is how people have used sources to interrogate just how precisely mythological the lost cause was, and question why we still deal with the histories of the lost cause, not only in textbooks, but in popular dialogue. Thank you.
Well, if you don't mind, Dr. Hayter, if we could open it up to the teachers. I think there was a lot of really good information. I also have a teacher asking if they'd be able to get a copy of the slides.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Does anyone have questions or thoughts for Dr. Hayter? And feel free to unmute yourself.
I do. Dr. Hayter, that was an awesome presentation. My major question, you had mentioned earlier about how Richmond was like ahead with voter registration. Is there supporting data for that? Is there?
I wrote a book about it.
Oh, what can you?
Yeah, it's called The Dream is Lost.
Okay.
It's got all the data you would want, by the way. Richmond actually elects an African-American to city council in 1948 and another one in 1964, well ahead of the Voting Rights Act. I think the interesting question is, how are they able to do it, right? How are they able to register voters, and why was that so successful?
What was the name of that book again?
It's called The Dream is Lost.
The Dream is Lost. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question, Dr. Hayter.
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. Given that you've provided us all this back information on the Confederate memorials, which is really informative, what are your thoughts right now then, as the memorials are starting to come down, and how does that strike you? Excuse me, about the historical memory of this moment moving forward?
So this might shock you, but I was on 60 Minutes with Anderson Cooper a couple of years back in 2018. And then before the racial unrest right now, I said, oh, we should keep them up and use them as historical, as ways to reteach the American history. That time has come and gone, by the way. So I think what the plan is now is to try to get these monuments into museums so that this history that I delineated today isn't lost on people. Because removal can facilitate forgetting, by the way. People who have generated or been responsible for generating Holocaust memory know this well. And I think that, those monuments were built by people with real ideas. And as much as I think that they were mythological, I still believe that they're worthy of historical interrogation so that we can question what history is and how we come up. Of course, there are historical facts, right? It's our interpretation of historical facts, I think, that got us to now. So I would say if these monuments are taken down and they are not used to interrogate the narrative that I spoke about, and even more importantly, the kind of long shadow of the lost cause, it's a completely wasted opportunity. It's the beginning of a more complicated phase. They're not the only artifacts in Richmond and the South to the Jim Crow system. There is an obsolescently segregated public school system, which many of you probably know about. There is the compression of poverty in the cities like Richmond left over from residential segregation. This city, it's interesting. It's like when we try to explain the racial unrest that characterizes America in 2020, we often leapfrog the 20th century to go right back to slavery. Many of the problems that the United States has faced, I could have just as easily given you a lecture on urban history that would explain precisely why historians told you this day was coming. Because it's the problems that characterize what's going on in America right now are more precisely to be found in the 20th century, right? With policies like redlining and urban renewal and freeway construction and the construction of public housing, the compression of poor people in the inner cities. All of that has had a profound influence on who we are right now. And a lot of people see that as being directly correlated with Confederate statuary. And I think if we don't use this moment as a point of reflection to think intently on those things, we run the risk of looking at these as symbolic political victories without actually thinking substantively about how we got right here. Does that answer your question?
Can I ask a quick
go ahead, man.
Well? My hometown is Stone Mountain, Georgia, so I come from the home of the largest Confederate monument in the world.
I've seen it, yeah.
But my follow-up question is, as these statues are taken down and hopefully rehomed somewhere, is your hope that they would then be used as commentary, not as Confederate monuments, but like you said, as sort of the, to continue to recontextualize those as commentaries on lost cause and early 20th century reaction to the Confederacy? Why
not turn to the primary sources, right? And use these, in Europe, they have what are called toxic museums, right? Where they have all of these old statues from regimes that have long since fallen, and they've taken the statues and put them in there, and you walk through there and it's an you're walking through all of this toxic history and what people intended when they built monuments to themselves or to authoritarians. And you walk out of there with an understanding of what people had to endure, right? Under these regimes and how people worked their way out of it. And so to me, I think that's precisely what should happen. Yeah.
And one last question. Do you think that's what's going to happen with these monuments?
Yes.
So you think
I know some things about what's happening right now. I can't tell
I'm
you,
sure.
Unfortunately. Right. Yeah.
Dr. Hayter, Mark's questions brought up a question of mine is what are your thoughts on reclaiming spaces like the Marcus David Peters Circle, formerly known as Lee, as well as reclaiming the base of the monument?
So, I've said this before. Reconciliation, right? And I think our inability to talk about these kind of darker chapters in American history has given rise to these types of reclamations. So they're kind of shockingly predictable result of our inability to talk about race more intently. Think of it this way. How how do you know how much progress we have and have not made if we continue to sweep this stuff under the rug? If we continue to tell these histories that don't do due diligence, that not only how far we come, but just how far back we were. And I think what we're dealing with now is a kind of frustration that's taking place in public spaces in large part because of our inability to actually come to the table and have civil discussions about this history, right? So my point is, I think it's a kind of predictable response to where we're at right now. And I think but if it doesn't lead to actual public policy, protests are meant to raise awareness. After you've raised awareness, you got to have a plan, right? And I think that's where we're at this critical inflection point right now, where the heightening and raising of awareness has in many ways happened, and the reclaiming of public spaces, this tactical urbanism, if you will, is got people to think about what's wrong. Now we have to start providing solutions. I'll talk all day if you guys have questions, by the way.
I had kind of an observation here.
Sure.
This seems to be kind of like the conundrum of this whole monument thing is, as you pointed out, most of them were being put up right around the time that many of the veterans were dying off, but it also is coinciding with the rise of Jim Crow. So I'm a Confederate reenactor myself, and I hear a lot of my friends talk about all this and being revisionist history. And I think that's why so many are saying, "Oh, this is revisionist history," is because, well, it's like they're trying to look at it in terms of being a way to moralize the Confederate veteran and the soldiers, the war. And I remember not long after the Charlottesville incident, the Virginia Pilot, they had put out on their Facebook page a copy of some articles. One was from the dedication of the monument that's in downtown Portsmouth.
Mm-hmm.
The other was from the one that's in downtown Norfolk.
Yep.
And I read over them, and the one in Portsmouth, it seemed like the article talked a lot about how the people there looked at it as a way just to memorialize the dead. And then one that went up in Norfolk years later was all about, almost that lost cause narrative, the idea that, these were gallant soldiers fighting for what they believed in. And
you're right. They can be both of these things. You're absolutely, I mean, we've got to concede that. It's like, on the one hand, you can have, I mean, there is no denying that the building of Confederate statuary in the early 20th century corresponds with veterans dying who had fought in the Civil War. There's no denying that. There's also no denying that the renaming of schools and things of that nature in the mid-20th century corresponds with the century mark of the Civil War. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, also, I have to coincide with these other darker chapters in American history, right? And I think the problem is we've struggled to negotiate the tension. There's an old story about one of the I think it was Sherman was marching down to Georgia, or somebody was on the frontier, and they run up on a Confederate soldier and they ask him, why are you fighting this for? He's like, well, it's because you're here, right? And it's perfectly possible that people were fighting this war for different reasons, right? What we know now, though, is that the lost cause and the people who are responsible for much of the toxic Confederate iconography is saturated. It eclipsed the variation that you just described. Does that make sense, by the way?
Yeah. One other thing is, I've been trying to search for this video on YouTube. It was a video I saw posted last month, I think it was. And it was from the Gettysburg battlefield, and a park ranger, he was doing a talk, and this was probably from a few years back, but he was kind of reflecting on some of the monuments on the battlefield. And he brought up the fact that, when they were first proposing to put a monument to the Confederates on the battlefield, even that was causing a lot of controversy in its day. And
Right.
this was like 1870s, 1880s.
Man, I could muck this up even worse, right? Like, think of it this way. It's like, there's no racial progressivism in the North during that time, right? In fact, Union soldiers on the frontier were almost single-handedly responsible for the Native American genocide in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So you get out west, and Native Americans have a problem with Union soldiers and monuments erected on them. So there's more than enough controversy on this stuff to go around, right? And I think on one thing Southerners are right about is that Northerners weren't fighting that war initially to free slaves. They were fighting to preserve Union, and the assumption that there was some racial enlightenment across the Mason-Dixon line just doesn't. The historical data doesn't bear that out. And if you look west, it gets even more controversial. I think the problem that we have now is if you look at some of the historical documents, and you look what the people who weren't Confederate veterans, the people who were the sons and daughters of Confederate veterans, and what they set out to do in the early 20th century. If you look at the document, that's where I think, especially a lot of historians, have the biggest problem with this. Like, it's mythologizing about a past and not looking at the documents in their entirety to tell a story that might somehow make us more enlightened as we walk away, knowing a little bit more about the past than otherwise. You know, if I gave this lecture.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on the removal of the Emancipation statue in Boston?
Is this the one with Lincoln?
Mm-hmm.
And unveiling the.
Right. Yeah, the paternalistic.
Well,
criticized as
all right, I'll just do this for the sake of argument, right? Lincoln also wasn't particularly progressive when it came to issues about race, and I don't believe that he was the great emancipator. Slaves freed themselves, and many, especially in Virginia. All right. They ran the Union lines. They literally ran away from, and they were the ones who applied the pressure on Lincoln to, in fact, use the Emancipation Proclamation as a military strategy, right? So instead of, of course that statute is problematic because because even if you watch the movie Lincoln, right, there are no actors in there other than Lincoln, and what it does is it centers Lincoln. In a way that belies what the historical record demonstrates, is that African Americans were actors in the execution of their own freedom. However, why not use that statute as an opportunity to tell that story? Why not surround it, right, and say, you want to know why this is wrong? And even more importantly, you want to know why people built it like this when they built it. Right? Because that's how people thought about the Civil War when that monument went up. It's also a way for Bostonians to vindicate, themselves as, being more racially progressive. These are the types of discussions I think that are going to move the conversation forward. So yes, it's a deeply problematic statute. But I think some of these, I said this on 60 Minutes, man, we lack imagination when we think about statuary, right? We think it's either tear them down or don't do anything with them, as if there's nothing in between that we could do to walk away and tell a more enriching story about American history. We can't, you don't deal with mythologies by making them disappear. You deal with them by presenting evidence that shows exactly why they're wrong. And I think that's a perfect opportunity to use that statute. In fact, there are more problematic statues in the North than that one, by the way. And I think we've got to use these as teachable moments. I mean, historians are always going to argue on behalf of addition more than subtraction, right? Because we believe in sources. In fact, we know much more about the American past now than, say, historical actors who were alive during it. I'll never forget an argument my father and my grandfather had about the Second World War, right? My grandfather was a veteran, and my dad was a World War II buff, and he had a bunch of history books in his house. And my grandfather seemed to think simply because he was in World War II, he knew more about the war than my father did. And my dad was like, you were in one place during the second. My grandfather drove a gas truck in the Battle of the Bulge. Grandfather refused, but it encapsulates this kind of tension that we have about how we remember history and people who lived through it.
Yeah, I just want to bring up a point that you made. I think that was a really good one, is thinking about coming at it from different perspectives too, and like for different people. Like, for example, my area of study is on Japanese Americans, and there are monuments to FDR, and there's a lot of conversation about what a fantastic progressive president he was, but he's also the one who incarcerated Japanese Americans. So I liked that your point to like thinking of multiple perspectives of approaching monuments too.
It's a slippery slope. Can you imagine what would have happened if we tore down Monticello 15 years ago? Has anybody been to Monticello lately? That slave tour is amazing, right? I mean, we know so much more about slavery at Monticello now from that slave tour. I mean, if we would have firebombed it, all that would have been lost, right? We've got to find a way. If we are truly interested in moving the needle forward, we got to be. The problem is the trauma that this stuff brings up makes it hard for people to deal with it. And I remember going on the slave tour with my mother, right, whose family is from Stanton, Virginia. And she was standing up at the beginning of that tour, and I looked over, she was on the ground. But I mean, everybody needs to go through that process. So you got to walk through the fire of this traumatic history to get us to some point of reconciliation. And I think, Emma, you're absolutely right? I mean, this is a slippery slope. People thought about the world in intolerably anachronistic ways, even as back far as 50 years ago, right? I mean, things that we think are common sense or bad ideas were widely accepted 50 years ago. But if we don't dive into why this is why when I teach the Holocaust, when I teach Nazi Germany, I said that the Nazis didn't create anti-Semitism, they industrialized it. It had been around Europe for a long time, by the way, a very long time. Jews were blamed for the bubonic plague. And what he did is he activated anti-Semitism because of a Great Depression. And we've got to dig into the ways that people thought historically. And I think we're in a very nebulous space right now, where people are struggling, at least in public forums, to think intently about, who wasn't, this is gonna sound like, who wasn't racist at the turn of the last century? That's how people thought about the world. The fact that most people thought that way, it's nothing short of remarkable. That if you assume that most people thought that people of color were of genetic inferior stock 100 years ago, that most people don't think that now, is absolutely extraordinary. And if you can figure out all the historical things that had to transpire in 100 years that got people away from these toxic ideas, or what we would consider toxic ideas, that's nothing short of remarkable, right? And so when we think about FDR, right, we have to think, well, how can we come to terms with these historical actors who didn't think about the world like we did, and who are complicated figures, right? It's like, it's difficult. On the one hand, Jefferson's a slave owner, right? On the other hand, he's the author of the Declaration of Independence, right? This is what Thomas says, is like, I always ask my students, it's like, what did Thomas Jefferson actually mean when he said that all men were created equal, right? Does anybody know that? By the way, this is a real question. I do, it's a loaded question, right? But a lot of people can't figure out what's like, he was given the proverbial middle finger to hereditary privilege in England, right? The fact that you are born into status, and the only way that you can break into the aristocracy is by birthright, right? So when he's saying all men are created equal, he's actually activating the machinery of Enlightenment thought. And he's saying, no, he's Lockean there, that you're born with a tabula rasa, and people, it's truly American, by the way. What he's saying is that through hard work and merit, that you can actually become an influential member of society, yada, yada, yada. Well, if we don't deal with Thomas Jefferson, we don't get to that conclusion. We don't get to negotiate the original sin of slavery and liberty, right? If we just wash him away. And I think that's where the American experience is much more enriching, much more complicated, and much more complex than we like to think about. And it's nothing short of remarkable we are where we are, and we still got a long way to go, given just how bad things were historically.
Well, I definitely want to be respectful of your time, Dr. Hayter. Does anyone else probably have time for one more question or comment, thoughts? I'm really happy to see Reese and Dr. Allen. If you guys have any thoughts too, I'd love to hear them.
It's more so as a comment, well, a ask.
Yeah.
The thing that I like about this is connecting to other people who are doing this work. And as soon as History United gets started up again, I am going to be inviting Dr. Hayter and Dr. Jody Allen to actually just do a repeat of what they talked about here today.
It'll be my pleasure.
I'm always looking for speakers to provide content, to talk about things that I'm not well versed in. So I will definitely be calling on you all, and I have enjoyed your presentations. This was like going to school,
Thank you.
So I enjoyed it. And like I said, I'm available by email. I've sent in a lot of resources that'll be posted on the resource page, and just contact me if you have any questions about anything local history as it pertains to Danville, Pennsylvania County, Caswell County, North Carolina, and genealogy. If you need any genealogy help, I can provide that also. And be on the lookout. I haven't made an announcement yet, but really soon I'll be opening the Danville Research Center for African American History and Culture. And so and I'm gonna have partner with the local university, just, bringing these stories to the students and the teachers. So just keep visiting the History United website to keep up with what we're doing, and just shoot me an email if you need anything. I'm here for anything you need. Thank you.
Oh, by the way, so I will say too, as a plug, Dr. Ayers and I are, we recognize that we're creating a webpage as a teacher resource where we're going to be translating historical texts for a wider audience on the new American history. Because a lot of these ideas that are circulating right now in the field aren't filtering down fast enough to a wider audience. I mean, there are things in textbooks that historians have moved long beyond. For some reason, we're not having these more enlightened conversations. Historians have a tendency to talk amongst themselves. And what we're trying to do is get these ideas to circulate beyond these communities. So be on the lookout for this. I think it'll be very helpful. We're going to be instead of reviewing books in these like isolated spaces, we want to share with a wider audience some of the more profound discoveries that have been taking place in the field over the last several years, and with a larger audience. And we're working with some really good historians up in Charlottesville and teachers to get this done. So I'm sure you'll be hearing about it sooner or later in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, I just want to say both to Dr. Brimmer and Dr. Hayter, this is like, I had no idea I was going to be here all day. I have on my calendar class prep for fall, but I wanted to be a student today. So it's a great opportunity. And I'm on William and Mary's working group for naming and renaming, principles of naming and renaming. And we're going through, you can't take the name off. One alum called in and told us William and Mary's going to hell. And there's all kinds of, so you've given me a lot to think about, Dr. Hayter, and to take back to the working group. And so you may be getting a call or an email too.
This may or may not shock you. I think the easy thing to do is to remove a name, right? It really is. It's like, well, wait a minute, right? It's like, you know what Julius Caesar did, when he went into France? It's like, where does it start? I understand the kids are frustrated, but we've got to find a way to use this to get them to reinterrogate the kind of intellectual process behind this, and why we're at this point, and how we've got to be very careful about how we move forward. And it's a fascinating time to be in higher education. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah.
Right.
I wouldn't be a president right now. Ever.
Right. Oh no. especially with COVID. Right?
Yeah.